we wanted to share this quotation from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. This can be a good global attitude to cultivate as you're doing media work, such as letters to the editor. And when you're trying to figure out your approach in your LTE, you can refer to this, that you're trying to convince people, you're not trying to antagonize people, you're trying to empower people. And obviously, the CCL mission is part of your mission as you work on letters to the editor. It doesn't have to be in every letter to the editor that you write, right? You can talk about bipartisanship, you can talk about being constructive, you can talk about the seriousness of the challenge. You don't have to pitch our, well, I shouldn't say our bill, the bill. We don't own the bill. You don't have to pitch the bill every time you write, but if you see an opportunity for it, go ahead. And that's because there are millions of Americans who don't understand carbon pricing yet. And we also need to empower individuals to have breakthroughs of personal and political power. That's part of CCL's mission too. Writing a letter to the editor is a wonderful way to experience that breakthrough feeling. So part of what you should do is enjoy it. You'll do your best work if you not only put your head into the LTE work, but your heart as well. Now we talk about the levers of political will in CCL, and there are 5. LTE writing fits into media relations. So we're trying to use the infrastructure of media to change minds and motivate people to seek solutions. There are other pieces of media relations. There's op-ed writing. There's also the universe of social media work, which is a big universe. And there's also editorial board meetings with newspaper staff. We can admit that newspaper readers tend to be older and perhaps whiter than average in the population, whereas social media participants are younger and more diverse, at least in many social media platforms. It's less true of Facebook. Newspapers are fading a bit, but it's also true that newspaper messaging is often shared on social media, which can increase the readership of newspaper writing. So, you know, you can copy a link to a newspaper article or an LTE, and you can tweet it with a comment. That's a great way to increase the reach of newspaper writing. And you know, some of your media work and your LTE work can reach out into other levers. You can lobby a congressman with a letter to the editor. If you mention a congressman's name, you can be sure that somebody on that staff is going to be going through the newspaper lit and saying, aha, look, you were mentioned here, Congressman. And somebody's going to read that in the congressman's office or congresswoman's office. So this is sort of what we're going to work on. We're going to explore it for a while, and then we're going to have a little bit of Q&A. And then finally, we'll let you go into the actual process of writing a draft in the later stage of tonight. CCL has a good bit of information on their webpage, and this is the link to that webpage. So, you know, feel free and study up on CCL's advice on LTE technique. We're going to present some of that in the next few minutes as well. It's good advice. Some of it is, you know, it seems like a lot to digest right at first. But it's also true that you don't have to do a deep dive into the science of letters to the editor to write some. You can just kind of dive in, you know, with the understanding that less is often more. You know, if you just write a few sentences, sometimes it has more impact than if you push their word limit of 300 words. Take it away, Rose.
Okay, great. And so on that note, I'll share a little bit about what we're calling the LTE formula, the letter to the editor formula. So we recommend, or CCL actually recommends, these 4 components. I'll go through them each. The first is to reference something. So that means write a letter that is in response to something in the news or a specific part of the news story in the publication that you're writing to, preferably. So it might be an article itself, another letter, or in some cases you can reference something that's just sort of happening in general, a current event or something. But ideally, if you can reference something specific in that paper, that's the best. Next slide, please. And then CCL also has articulated for us a sort of news hierarchy and recommends to, when possible, to respond to some of the articles that are highest up in that news hierarchy. And the logic there is just that these are sort of the parts of the paper that the paper is sort of really prioritizing. And so letters that respond to those parts will be particularly attractive to them and something they want to publish. So the editorials, so these are the sort of top of the hierarchy, followed by front page news. Many of our newspapers are just online now, so you can sort of, in some cases, get a sense of what is considered front page, but it might not be literally. Staff written columns, so this is by an individual member of the staff. Locally written op-eds, so opinion pieces that were written by, you know, somebody in the area, as opposed to sometimes newspapers will take an op-ed that's just sort of written somewhere in Texas or something and republish it. That's a little bit lower down. And then syndicated columnists being a sort of one of those columnists who might write for lots of different papers as opposed to the specific staff. There are some other elements. Of course, these aren't the only elements of the newspaper, but as they're the top 5, I thought we could focus on those. Other letters to the editor, things that, you know, somebody else already wrote in about, are also something you can respond to. But they are, you know, just to keep in mind, those are a little lower on the hierarchy, so they might not be as likely to be published as if you're responding to one of these things. And then, as I noted, you can also write about other current events. Sometimes, you know, you could use a holiday or a weather event or, you know, something like an inauguration as a jumping off point. And sometimes they'll publish that even if you're not responding to anything, but it's a really good rule of thumb to aim to respond to something. Next, please. And then when you're responding to something, part of the sort of formula is to make sure you make it really clear what you're responding to. So this isn't a place for subtlety. You'll want to reference the article that you're responding to immediately in the first sentence. You can do that by sort of just building the article name and date into the sentence, like, you know, my jaw dropped when I read the April 14th news article, title, title, title. Or you can put the article name and date in parentheses at the end of the sentence. I do that sometimes, like, the school board took a big leap forward in promoting state sustainability last week, and in parentheses, then you say the title and the date. But either way, you just want to make sure it's very clear to them why you're writing in about this thing, and so they'll prioritize it. Okay, next slide, please. So after referencing something, the next important piece is transition to climate. So, you know, as Chris said at the outset, we're writing these letters largely to sort of work to help us with our mission of building political will for a livable future. And so that means we want to talk in some way about climate, with the exception of, you know, like Chris mentioned, I actually just submitted one yesterday, I think, that didn't mention climate at all, but it was about bipartisanship. And that's another important value for CCL. And so you don't always have to talk about climate. You are a free individual to write what you want. But for the most part, transitioning to climate is the second step. So this can be, again, you know, taking anything like, I remember seeing recently, like last year, a rainy baseball season and transitioning to climate, or something that's explicitly about climate and, you know, taking that and responding. And we'll do some practice with some real newspaper examples and thinking about how we can transition shortly. Next slide, please. So after mentioning climate, it's really crucial to identify a solution. So this doesn't have to be the Energy Innovation Act, which, as Chris mentioned, is the bill that we lobby for. We lobby for that, but we support a lot of things. And climate action in general is definitely something we support. So the key here is really just not sort of introducing a crisis or, you know, something that's frankly very scary and then leaving it, but rather saying we need to act and we need to do this. So that's really, really key. As I said, you can mention the specific Energy Innovation Act, but it's not crucial. You can also mention more generally, like carbon fee and dividend, which is a description of the kind of policy it is. You can even just sort of mention we need, you know, climate policy, or if you feel like that's the most appropriate for whatever you're responding to. And then next, the final piece that follows the solution is the call to action. So this is different than a solution in that it's actually asking the readers to do something. It might not be every reader. It might be you're hoping that your member of Congress will do something and they and their staff are one of your readers. Or maybe it is something that you want just people in the community to do something about. And doing something can also be prioritize this, or you know, keep in mind this. It doesn't have to be like, come out to the streets now, but action is also great wherever we can build that in. Okay, next. So then a couple of just sort of general do's are to be timely. So timing is really important. The sooner you submit a letter in response to a story or an opinion piece, the more likely it will be published. This is especially true for daily newspapers, which some of our Virginia papers are daily. If a letter is received, you know, within a day or two, it's likely, much more likely to get published. Some of our papers only publish weekly or so, so you've got a little bit more wiggle room. But so timely is relevant in that case, but timely is still important. The second one, mention your member of Congress by name. This is more of a general rule than an absolute rule. As I said, you don't always need to say anything specific, but when you mention your member of Congress by name, I think Chris mentioned this at the beginning, you can be pretty sure that someone in their office is going to see it because they've got their Google alerts set up appropriately. And especially, you know, valuable to mention the member of Congress by name if you're kind of using some of the values that you know will resonate with them. So, you know, if they're a conservative, maybe it's about sort of accountability or liberty or job creation. If they're liberals, maybe that's a little bit more about social justice and fairness, or things that are specific to your member of Congress and their priorities. Staying respectful is pretty self-explanatory, and as Chris kind of set the stage with the Justice Ginsburg quote, we want others to join us. And so it's really crucial that we aren't sort of sowing divisions. And then the last piece is to sort of engage the reader. This is, of course, just sort of generic writing advice, but just want to make the point that letters to the editor aren't, unique from good writing. You don't have to write sort of something that sounds like a newspaper tone. You can use imagery and make things personal, talk about current events, can ask questions or, figures of speech or sayings. You can even make analogies or use metaphors. You can really write in your own tone, your own voice, and bring all your own kind of strategies to it. And then next. On the flip side, a few of the things to avoid, demonizing. So this is just the flip side of respect. So keep in mind, we're responding to a story as a way of introducing a different point of view. Raising issues that could turn off readers. So, when possible, it's best to sort of stay neutral on issues that are, really hot and might, create some, turn some people off of CCL. So for example, again, a general rule is nuclear power is one of those examples. CCL doesn't have a specific position about nuclear power. You can bring it up if you want, but just to be really mindful that, again, our goal is to make our tent bigger. And so when we bring up things that are sort of hot button, I think is CCL's term for it, we want to make sure we're not kind of harming our ability to do that. And then the last part to avoid lecturing is the flip side of engagement. So try not to lecture or just sort of regurgitate some of the talking points you've seen on CCL's website, but actually just write conversationally. Okay, and then next. All right, when you're ready to send, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, that CCL's community website does actually have a letter to the editor tool that you can use to directly submit the letter to the paper of your choice. Though I often recommend going just to the opinions and letters section of the newspaper of interest and reading their instructions for how to submit, because then it comes from your personal address and you're sending it exactly the way they like to receive it. But if you can't find that, the CCL tool can be really helpful. The subject line, you want to get their attention and tell them exactly what's going to be in the email. So name of story and page number. Sometimes I write letter to the editor in the subject line as well. Some of them have a sort of like a portal, I guess, or a box that you type in the letter right in their website itself. But this is for those that say, email it to letters at. When you do it, don't send it as an attachment, just put the letter right in the email itself. It makes it a lot easier for them. Then the next piece is to track your action. So on the community website, again, CCL has an action tracker, and you're able to track all letters you submit, even if they're not published, and then you can go back and update it to note that it was published. And this is just a really helpful way of letting your chapter know, and also CCL as a whole kind of get a sense of all the work that we're doing and understand the impact that we're making. The next piece is to check back regularly. They don't often tell you if they're publishing your letter, especially at smaller newspapers. And so often I could have actually missed some of the ones I've sent, except that I set myself a calendar reminder to go back and look and see if it was published. And then when you're successful, let us know. So, share with others on the Virginia Slack workspace. We've got a media channel, and we'll share the link to that for anyone who's not on it yet. And definitely let your chapter leads know. And if you know who the liaison is to your member of Congress, you can let them know too, because they'll want to be sure to pass on your work too. If your letter doesn't get published, it's okay. It happens sometimes, and it doesn't mean anything about your letter. By submitting the letter in itself, you're sending an important signal to that newspaper about things their readers care about. And then one of your teammates will write another letter to that newspaper, or you might write one in a week or two or 2 months. And now they've sort of heard this topic before. And so when they receive this second letter, they're seeing more letters and they realize this is a real priority, we should publish it. So your letter that didn't get published still played a really important role in that. So that's just something important to keep in mind as well. By the way, I think we can share these slides as well in case you're feeling like there's a lot of details to track. We just wanted to share them now, but we'll be sure they're more accessible for you after. Okay, next slide, and then back to you, Chris.
So we did want to make you aware that Stephanie Burns put in the work of creating a website for Virginia CCL, and one of the files within that website is a published media file. So if you want to see some examples of letters to the editor from around the state by CCL volunteers, just to sort of see some prevailing concepts and approaches, you can go to that cclvirginia.org/publish-media site and poke around and see what you think. So it can be comforting to see how other people are doing it before you try your first one. I wanted to add a couple of ideas to what Rose was relating to you about things to avoid. You know, in my long process of working on LTEs, I've found one of the tempting things to do is when you like read something that's just totally wrong. You want to sort of vent on that and say, no, oak trees are not the cause of climate change or whatever. But try not to yield to the temptation in your LTE of repeating wrong ideas of others, because a lot of times readers have this weird thing of repeat something twice and I believe it. So you don't really want to do the work of the wrong-headed people for them by repeating. So try to avoid that. Also, try to avoid never getting to your solution. You know, at first, you may have a very heartfelt response to something, but always remember to get to your solution before you run out of words. And we picked out a few LTEs that illustrate some good technique from Virginia. This is a pretty short one that was published by the Washington Post. You have to be pretty controlled with your word total for the Washington Post, because they really sort of want it to be under 200 words, and it's very limiting. I thought that Richard here from Northern Virginia did a great job, particularly, you notice at the start, he cites 2 articles from the Post. So the editors can be impressed that he really reads it, because he read 2 articles and then he compared them and put it together in his own mind. And then he turns on a dime and gets to the what he is presenting as the solution, putting a price on carbon emissions, and closes with a reminder that we're talking about our children and grandchildren here. So kudos to Richard for getting his message across in a very limited number of words. I couldn't pick out any word that didn't need to be there. So that's great work. Sometimes you'll find yourself writing a 300-word LTE, but before you hit send, pruning it down and realizing, oh, I really didn't need to go off on that tangent because that doesn't really get the point across. This is also a very short LTE from a Dr. Golden in Virginia Beach to the Virginia pilot. And he's very focused here. He talks about a bill that has to do with climate solutions in regenerative farming. And he speaks, he actually is responding to another LTE, but he uses it to focus on sort of praising Congresswoman Luria and Congresswoman Spanberger for their bipartisan work in introducing and sponsoring this bill. So the focus here is on bipartisanship and on working for solutions, even though there's actually no mention made of the Energy Innovation Act. It's still great. Sometimes, you know, your opportunity doesn't really include a great way to get to the bill, but, you know, you can still move the needle. And then this one is considerably longer. I had to fit it on 3 separate slides, but I just thought that this one from Richmond volunteer Molly Sullivan was great because she advocates for us to consider climate change to be a family topic, a kitchen table topic, which is so often missing from our attitude toward climate change. We, you know, we may talk about how much we're spending for our car insurance, or how we need to fix the septic tank, or, you know, whatever. But do we ever get to something that's really important for our family, climate change? So I just thought that she did a good job here. And it illustrates what I was saying earlier, that there is always room to be heartfelt in your LTE writing. It really makes it more impactful when you are, as long as you do so from a very positive place. So, you know, very, very different approaches there. But I also wanted to communicate the idea that there are very many valid approaches to writing an LTE. You don't need to, you know, although the format and the structure does work really well along the lines of what CCL suggests, and, you know, often the newspaper will pay much more attention to you if they see a reference to an article in your first sentence. It's simple vanity. They want to promote the idea that they're the place to go for information. But still, you can have different approaches to writing your LTE. We wanted to mention one thing that has been worked upon in Virginia, and that is the volunteer Alan Phillips up in Northern Virginia has created a Google Sheet for newspapers in Virginia, and that's a useful resource. Actually, I'm going to pause my share for a minute. And I wanted to find a link. Shoot.
Want me to grab it, Chris, to the spreadsheet?
Yeah, that would be great, Rose. I'm getting disoriented with that.
Oh, I think we all know the feeling. Okay. This should be it. Ooh. There you go. Just pasted it in the chat.
Yeah, in this document, the really interesting information is on the newspapers tab. So Alan's gone through the work of finding all these newspapers in our region and identifying whether they accept letters to the editor and how you actually submit a letter. That's a great resource.
Okay, the access. Let me fix it. I think Google has changed its default settings, so I'll retry this. Yep. It should work now if you hit refresh. Thanks for letting us know. So yeah, when you get in there, now I see lots of anonymous shapes coming in. You'll see exactly what Stephanie said, all the various outlets we could think of. If you see one that's missing, definitely let us know, or I think you'll actually be able to add it directly in.
And you may find out, you may be able to add to it by figuring out the link to send an email or the editor's name or something like that that needs to be filled in as well. So let's go back.
And actually, is this a good moment for me to plug our writers core, or are we getting to that?
Absolutely, why not?
Okay, great. Well, this is what I'm excited about. So this year is, we have a historic opportunity to enact climate legislation. And so we're really kicking in high gear with our media work. And we've created what we call a writer's core which is a team of volunteers who are interested in writing. So hopefully all of you are interested in joining this group. To sign up to join our writers core, you just follow this, go to this Google document, and it will have a sign up sheet. You can also, another opportunity, so there's writing, but then there's also, we need folks who are willing to track newspaper articles so we can find opportunities to write letters to the editor. So you can also, in that sheet, sign up to track newspaper articles, and you can pick which newspaper you'd like to track. I just picked the list of available newspapers are ones that accept letters to the editor that we're aware of. So definitely sign up for either of those opportunities. We'll add you to a Google group for the Writers Core. So then whenever we find a good opportunity to write a letter to the editor, we'll email that group and you'll learn about it and you'll be able to respond if you'd like with a letter. So thanks, everyone.
There's great potential for teamwork there too. You know, somebody can spot the article and say, hey, there's a great article about Antarctic melting in the paper this morning, and I can't write an LTE because I got one in last week. Can anybody else try this one? You know, so you can cooperate with each other and keep the pot simmering on the stove even when some of you become ineligible, because oftentimes a newspaper has an ineligibility period. After you write a letter to the editor, they won't print another one for 30 or 60 days. So someone else is going to have to carry the torch for the group. So we mentioned the bonus points for mentioning the member of Congress or senator. And remember that you can widen the audience for your letter to the editor by sharing on social media. If you get a letter to the editor published, make sure and put the link on your Facebook. Get it onto the Facebook for your CCL chapter, if your CCL chapter has a Facebook. Put it on Twitter, and CCL Virginia Twitter will share it. So, you know, and again, if you mention Tim Kaine in your Twitter post, his staff is going to see that, just like they're going to see it in the newspaper as well. So when you're starting out writing LTEs, you may feel nervous, and you can consider asking a fellow CCL volunteer to serve as your first reader. I'm happy to read your draft, and there are others who are happy to read your draft and say it's perfect as it is, or do you this or whatever. Don't let the perfect become the enemy of the possible. Your time and your number of words are limited. And as long as you've been civil and constructive, you can hit send. It's not, just think of it as not your last chance. Look upon it as an ongoing conversation with maybe a 2-month gap between your chances to talk, because you become ineligible. And then you have to wait until your time runs out. And there's really no contradiction between your desire to say your piece and your desire to serve CCL. You're here for both, and you are enough. So let's see, who has questions? I know that there were a couple of things in the chat, but were any? Mark, you want to unmute yourself?
What is the difference between an LTE and an op-ed?
Well, there's a fairly clear length difference. LTEs do not go beyond 350 words, and more commonly they're maybe 250 to 300. An op-ed is going to be minimum 600 words, and it can go up to 700.
That depends on the newspaper?
In general, that's the way it is. Now, I know in the Winchester Star that you use, they don't seem to make a big distinction between LTEs and community forum posts, but a lot of larger newspapers will make that distinction.
One more difference, I think, is that an op-ed in kind of maybe going along with the length is, yeah, it's a bit heftier in all ways, maybe. You don't necessarily have to be responding to something when you write an op-ed, because it's sort of meant to be like a standalone, really piece, as opposed to the letters, which I think they think of a bit more as conversational. So often for the op-ed, I think you really need like something really timely that's happening, or, you know, yeah, sort of just like a really sort of strong message. And CCL does share op-ed templates. You might maybe seen maybe every month or every 2 months with some talking points that you can use. And I think we've had a little success with those, but yeah, maybe the heft thing is just what I wanted to emphasize.
We could mention that Rose was able to use one of those templates and add a little bit of local Virginia material, and it was published in the Virginia Mercury online journal. I agreed with everything you said, Rose, and I also wanted to add that the amount of work for an op-ed is often much more. You know, you can write a letter to the editor in a half an hour or an hour, and maybe get somebody else to proof it real quickly, and off it goes. Usually with an op-ed, you may take a couple hours to write it, and then you may have to go back to it the next day and reread it and say, I've got something here, or this is not working. You may bring in someone to help edit it for you, and then you may look at it again. You know, it can end up being several days' work to do an op-ed. Although, having said that, the templates from CCL are very helpful and do decrease the amount of work if you go that way.
Chris, I have a question. You may have answered it already. This is Jim Peters. But if I'm going to write a letter to the editor, especially if I'm going to mention at the end that I'm a member of CCL, I would certainly want somebody in CCL to take a look at it. I would feel uncomfortable posing as a CCL representative without really being one.
Well, yeah, that's fine, and we're certainly happy to assist you by being your reader. We're sort of inconsistent in Virginia whether we mention that we're CCL volunteers or not with our letters. Often we've been known to send a letter to the editor and not actually mention that we are CCL volunteers. And you know, there's no right or wrong way, but I think that it might be helpful for us to do more of mentioning that we're volunteers. It's probably good to put the word volunteer in there so that people understand that we are not paid representatives of CCL. We are citizen volunteers of CCL.
Chris, there's also a question in the chat. Does the bill keep the same name in this session of Congress?
That is a really good question, and I don't think we have an answer yet. It will definitely not carry the same number, because at the end of each session, everything that is not passed into law is basically swept away. It's really kind of up to Congressman Deutsch if he is going to stick with the format and the name, or if he is not. So it makes it a little bit of a challenge because we're waiting.
Can you talk, this is Allie, can you talk more about why they're important? Because I know that we talk about calls, how Congressman staff always tell us how important phone calls and letters to them are. But letters to the editor, I mean, nobody reads newspapers anymore. I just question how valuable they are. So I'm wondering if any research has been done on how important they are, what their impact is. Could you address that?
Well, it's a good question. I would say that it's inaccurate to say nobody reads newspapers anymore, but I will, as I mentioned, definitely fewer people read newspapers now than did 10 years ago. Now, that is certainly less true of the highest echelon of newspapers like the Post and the New York Times. They still have fairly large readerships. But again, you know, younger people are moving away from paper and ink newspapers, definitely. Having said that, though, all of the newspapers that we follow in Virginia also have an online version. Those online versions have some readers. So they're making a stab at being relevant by becoming online. It's just that, you know, a lot of people would rather visit CNN online to get their news, you know. So definitely newspapers are not a growth industry, but still there's a lot of people that read them and a lot of people that pay attention to the ideas in them. Again, they're older and whiter than the population as a whole.
And I'd just add one thing to that, Chris, which is sort of, as we've alluded to, mentioning the member of Congress's name can be particularly helpful. It sort of sends the same signal that you, a constituent, you know, you care about this, and it's public. And so, of course, when that sort of message is visible to other people, I think that's a bit of an added pressure or a different pressure than a phone call makes. And then just the last thing that I recently learned, actually through CCL did a letter to the editor, Citizens Climate University maybe, last week, I think. And one thing that was shared there is that letters are one of the most frequently read parts of newspapers. So even though they sort of seem like deep in there, it seems to be the thing that readers actually really go there to read in a lot of cases. So letter readership is probably higher maybe than we think, even with all of the caveats about newspapers kind of having struggles.
I think that's a great point, Rose. I would, that sort of matches my experience. When I open the Richmond Times-Dispatch, I go straight to the letters page, and then I may take a glance to see the summary of the basketball game that I was interested in, and that's probably going to be it for me. Although, you know, I actually, that's not quite true, because I'll actually leaf through a few pages to see if there's an article that can be responded to with an LTE. But definitely the LTE page is the thing I look at. That's not true for everybody, but I think for a lot of readers, it is the first thing they look at. Other questions or comments?
Yes, I have another comment. I wrote a letter to the Winchester Star that was published, and before I was able to read it, someone else in my chapter read it and gave me the link to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I clicked on that link. I was surprised to see that when it's online, people can talk about it. And there were a lot of exchange back and forth about my letter and comments, and even went far astray of the subject just to criticizing each other. And I was just surprised and shocked at all of that. Is that a common occurrence?
Yes, that's fairly common. Those are persons usually who have, often those are people who are subscribers to the newspaper, because sometimes the newspaper won't let you into that file to make a comment unless you're authenticated as somebody who has a subscription. But yeah, often the letters will actually get a conversation going online on the website for the newspaper. Yep. Okay, well, let's move on. In our final half hour, we moved a little faster than we thought, which is probably good. In our final half hour, we're going to look at three, excuse me, they are not imaginary news pieces, they are actual news pieces. And then each of you can think about one of them to try to construct a letter to the editor based upon it. And that'll give you an opportunity to apply some of these ideas that we've explored while it's still fresh in your mind. So one of these is an article that appeared in the Washington Post very recently on January 21st. And I became aware of it because oddly, the Richmond Times-Dispatch reprinted it 2 days later. So we had the opportunity to try to reply to it in the Richmond Times-Dispatch as well. So, you know, if you want to copy and paste this article, or I guess just click on it, you can see what it is. It's basically a news article having to do with the ocean that surrounds Antarctica, and they're discovering that it is much warmer than it used to be, and this is causing some concern that glacier collapse will be accelerating around the coastal zone of Antarctica. Now, we also noticed this week, in fact, it was just yesterday, the Roanoke Times printed an editorial. The editors were discussing something called the coal tax credit, which I was not even aware of. So apparently in the General Assembly, there's an effort to get rid of the coal tax credit. So some of the members of the General Assembly who don't live in coal country want to get rid of it because they feel that it is an invalid use of state money to support the coal industry. So the editors of the Roanoke Times looked at this and, you know, they say, well, you know, the coal tax credit is basically kind of senseless. But on the other hand, who wants to take care of coal communities? And, you know, expressing great concern there. So it's an editorial that's very consistent with CCL values. So a little imagination can come up with a good way to express the idea that we certainly want to support coal communities, even though we don't support the mining of coal. And then finally, I hunted around and I spotted a news article in the Fredericksburg newspaper, the Freelance Star. And it has to do with John Kerry attending a virtual climate adaptation summit with representatives of other nations and the conversation that ensued. So, you know, that was an interesting article.